NATO has responded to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine with a new strategy, 2 new members, and one of the most sweeping reforms in its entire history. It will massively increase its troops and weapon systems in Eastern Europe, especially in the Baltic states. The Rapid Reaction Force will even be increased 7-fold. With this, NATO wants to deter Putin from attacks against further neighboring states. Our topic today: NATO versus Putin, going toe-to-toe with the aggressor. A warm welcome to The Point. Let me introduce my panel today. Karolina Wigura, political editor of Kultura Liberalna, Poland's leading online weekly. Gustav Gressel, NATO and military expert with the European Council on Foreign Relations. And Alexey Yusupov, a Russia expert with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation here in Berlin. A warm welcome to all of you. Now, in response to Putin's war on Ukraine, NATO has undergone its most sweeping reform and biggest transformation since the end of the Cold War. Putin has achieved the opposite, it seems, of what he wanted, namely weakening NATO, pushing it back westwards. At their summit last week, NATO welcomed, or nearly welcomed, 2 new members. So did NATO do the right thing there?
Absolutely. NATO reconfirmed its open door policy that countries that want to apply can apply. Sweden and Finland have both made it clear before the war that, although they are not members of NATO, the freedom to choose the alliance is one of the core rights granted to them under the Paris Charter, and that it would not see this right being diminished or limited by Russia. And this was, if you go back to the December 17th proposal that Putin put on the table, the kind of forced neutralization of Eastern Europe and all countries in the East was something that they bitterly objected. So it is certainly the right thing.
Karolina, Poland has demanded an improvement of the defences on the eastern flanks, more troops, more weapons, for many, many years. So is Warsaw happy now?
Warsaw is quite happy. We understand that this is a compromise. It is perhaps not the whole that Warsaw wanted, but not only Poland, but also other states of the eastern flank are quite happy with the results of the NATO summit and the new strategy. It is quite obvious that NATO has never changed so much, and it is also very obvious that it is a compromise, but well, it's very difficult to have such a compromise among so many member states, so we should be satisfied.
Now, Alexey, let's look to Russia. This confrontation with NATO, what's the reaction in the commentariat in Moscow? What the political circles? What do they think?
There is a variety of voices and opinions, different shades of it. Most of them are saying that we told you, so this is the we told you so fraction. Pretty much they're saying masks are off. This was the plan throughout the last 30 years anyway. So
that's
now
Putin's narrative,
that's
right?
Putin's narrative, and now we can go it into fulfillment. This is the more propagandistic tone you have. Then you have the strain of thought saying, look, it always was between the US and Russia, and whatever happens in Europe only shows that this is a bilateral conflict. This gives, of course, additional reputation to Russia's standing, but it's also a propagandistic note. And then there is a third, more sober, I would say, tone coming up from professional, military, also diplomatic circles saying, look, this thing has never been planned like this, and the risks of inadvertent escalation are extreme with this new NATO-Russia border coming up, with lacking lines to deconflict, with an absolutely new militarization dynamic. So is this really something, or at least it's not a doubting voice, but it's a voice saying we should really be careful about things which are happening on the European theater now. So you have different voices, but all of them treat this thing as the new normal. Everyone has accepted it.
Now, NATO, some have declared NATO brain dead in the past, but Putin's aggression against Ukraine kissed the alliance awake. NATO now confronts its biggest realignment since the Cold War. Let's have a quick look.
on land, in the air and on the water. NATO has been present in the Baltics and Poland since Russia's activity and occupation of Crimea in 2014, as a deterrent so far. Now the transition from deterrence to a state of alert. The NATO troops already present on the eastern borders will be increased to brigade level. That means up to 5,000 soldiers each, and bases are to become permanent. Germany has already announced its intention to lead the combat brigade in Lithuania. NATO's Very High Readiness Joint Task Force will be increased sevenfold in the event of an emergency, to 300,000 soldiers. More money will flow. 1 billion euros will be invested for the development of new technologies. The path is clear for Finland and Sweden to join the military alliance. With this, NATO will grow to 32 member states. Exercises in the event of an attack are underway, like in this maneuver in the Baltic Sea. Does NATO now have a permanent grip on Putin?
Well, Gustav Gressel, does it? Does NATO have a permanent grip on Putin?
Well, if all the measures that are talked about now are implemented, then the capability to deter Russian aggression are fairly high and fairly good. However, I mean, a lot of stuff is in the details and how it will be implemented and when and what's the timeline, because a lot of the goals are fairly vague, as like the 300,000 men to be held under arms. Not yet clear at what level of readiness. The old NATO response force was sort of 30 days readiness. I don't know if we can manage 300,000 men in 30 days readiness. Where will they be located, etc. It also needs to be said that as long as the war in Ukraine is ongoing, basically Russia is not in a military position to do anything about what is happening now. We have seen barracks from Kaliningrad being emptied to be sent to reinforce the Donbas offensive now. The Finnish border is even emptied out and people sent to Ukraine. We will however Russia might react in practice, we will only see that after the end of this war, and this war is still undecided. We really don't know what is coming out of that. So a lot of unknowns, and I'd be careful to make long-term predictions on the current situation.
Are you suggesting that Putin or Russia is too weak to oppose NATO's eastern flank?
Now they are too weak to oppose because they're bogged down in Ukraine. Once they have finished the war, it will depend on how they end it, and then they will initiate probably a deep military reform, because the war in Ukraine, to be very frank, has not shown that the Russian army is that capable as they thought, and they thought they were. And I think a lot of issues will demand structural change on the Russian side. And this is something that actually will happen regardless of what NATO will do. It has happened regardless of what NATO did before. If you see the strengthening of the northern dimension of the Russian military, the sort of westward moving, the strengthening of the southern and the western military district, that's happened long before Sweden and Finland were NATO members or this war escalated. So I think we kind of overestimate how much we are the drivers in Russian military policies and underestimate how much they drive themselves into things.
And also the relative failure of the military advances has also resonated with the Russian intellectual and political elites. And there are a lot of people, coming back to our first question, saying, is this really what the Russian army should be capable of? So there will be a reform whatsoever, regardlessly of what's happening outside.
Well, there's a nice quote that I can bring in now. Somebody has said recently, we thought Russia had the second best army in the world, and now we're seeing they have the second best army in Ukraine. Is that a fair assessment?
It has been the expectation that the Russian economy will collapse and the Russian army will prevail. It has come to be in a completely different way. The Russian economy is fairly stable.
I mean, we're talking about NATO. If you compare it to NATO, the military capabilities of Russia versus NATO,
I think there is nothing to be added. There is no, and this is why risks of further extension of conflict, be it to Moldova, be it to other regions, I assess them as completely non-realistic at this current moment. Doesn't mean that it will not happen in 2, 3, 5, 6 years down the road, but at the current moment, this is the single most challenging task for the Russian army military forces to stabilize and sustain the successes and gains they have in Ukraine. So, yes.
But I have to come in. A lot of these illnesses that plague the Russian army plague particularly European armies as well. There is a difference between paper and what troops actually have. There is a low state of readiness of materials. Some stuff is really old. It was just sort of superficially refurbished. It doesn't work the way it was intended to be. Of course, the big difference in NATO is there's the US army. It's combat-proof, it's capable, it's high-tech. Which is, as long as the Americans are there and are committed to Europe, I don't think the Russians play with and fiddle with that. If the wind in Washington changes, we will live in a different world, but that's subject to probably further questions.
I want to go to Karolina with Poland. Will Poland, which has been said to be sort of on the front line very soon, or possibly on the front line very soon, will Poland send troops to the Baltics, or will it keep its troops inside to prepare for any eventuality?
I think it's still very flexible, and we will see what's going on, what will come. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus told once that everything flows. And I think this is exactly what will be happening with this NATO strategy. It's an important step, I don't have any doubts about it, but then how it will look like, what Poland will decide. Poland as a very important hub now, playing an important role in delivering weapons also to Ukraine. We will see. One comment I would just like to make about the capability of Russia to reform its army. I don't doubt that they will undertake a reform, but the question is whether they are capable of doing it effectively. I mean, first, we were told by many experts during the pandemic that whilst Europe was putting money into recovery funds and the pandemic, etc., Russia was putting money into military. And this is first thing. And the second thing is, of course, we say that the reform will be undertaken after the war is over. But will the war be over? And when will it be over? Because it doesn't seem like a war that was going to end. It rather seems like a frozen hot conflict.
While we're in Poland, Kaliningrad, which is a Russian exclave on Polish territory, if you will, are you worried about it?
Yes, and Poles are very worried about it because it seems like this is the only exception for the stability and security that NATO brings to this part of the region. And of course, not only Poles. So you could see the reaction of the Baltic states. The blockade, partial blockade of the transport of goods that was decided by Vilnius, the government in Vilnius. So yes, Kaliningrad is ironically because it seemed it's a very small place. It's only, if I'm right, 15,000 square kilometers. So it's really small. It has only 1 million inhabitants, and yet, according to many experts, there are nuclear weapons there, and if not nuclear, then still very dangerous weapons.
Alexey, briefly, could it be a reason for Putin to move?
Kaliningrad, except for the factual data, huge symbolic potential or symbolic significance for the Russian, let's say, revanchist ideology. So the 4 Ks, if you will, because in Russian it's the letter K for Crimea, for Kaliningrad, for Kazakhstan, and for the Kuril Islands on the Japanese border. Those are all areas which contribute immensely to the idea that Russia is a great Eurasian power, or even a global power, if you will. And Kaliningrad is one of those. So I think it has been smart that despite a lot of tension in Lithuania and Poland, the European Commission has not gone the way of escalating, because it doesn't help Ukraine. And I think this realization shows us that even in Brussels, people understand that it is an issue which could trigger further hostile actions. So while war is going on in Ukraine, it's unwise to open up a separate, different theater of conflict. So you're right, it's super dangerous. It's very, very, very slippery. And I guess, and this is something we can read along the lines on the Russian side, with the military experts as well, the fear that it will escalate without political intent is huge. So the one thing is the political intent, if there is a marching order, and we don't know how it works because no one can look into the head of Vladimir Putin. On the same time, you have this dynamic of, you have a lot of hardware, you had a lot of new dynamics, you have very little communication. There has been good experience between Norway and Russia, for example, where despite all of the conflicts, the Navy commanders have had a standing line so that they can de-escalate or deconflict on a level below the political level. At the moment, we don't have that.
Okay.
We have the US-Russia contact. We don't have a SACEUR contact from NATO to Russia. We don't have a Navy contact in the Baltic Sea, which de facto now transforms into a NATO sea in a way.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of risk there. And this is why I feel that both sides will look very, very intensely into looking for ways to manage this new confrontation. Because, as you're saying, and I agree, it will probably stay here for years and years and years to come.
So what's the NATO point of view on that?
Well, the problem with deconflicting mechanisms between Russia and NATO is that Moscow wants to talk to Washington. And when it comes to common structures, SACEUR is almost accepted because it's an American commander. But when we talk, for example, about the multinational corps in Szczecin, which is a NATO multinational corps and which is responsible for military operations in the Baltic area, it's not taken seriously in Moscow because it's not American. And I think, well, you know, in Moscow thinking, it's sort of the Pentagon commands and all the other multinational formations are just minions who take the orders, and there's no point in talking to them. And that makes these things very difficult. The deconflicting mechanisms with the US still work somehow. They're degraded. Gerasimov was not really happy to talk to his US counterparts for some time, but they're still, compared to the others, they're still functional. Another hotspot on this is, of course, that maybe in the future the Black Sea again, because Moscow is happy to talk to Turkey, but not to anybody else, not to Romania bilateral, not to Bulgaria, and not to any NATO force. There's now the equivalent set up in Constanta, a multinational corps southeast. That is difficult. However, I think without an intent to escalate, I think incidents can be tamed. If there is an intention to escalate, any incident will do because they kind of support the general narrative.
True. Well, the one person who thinks that might happen that way is Ukraine's President Zelensky. He is certain that Putin will not stop in Ukraine, instead continue with attacks on other countries. Let's listen in.
The question is, who will be next for Russia? Moldova, or the Baltic countries, or Poland? The answer is all of them.
All of them? Is he right? Or is he exaggerating?
This is historical experience that is talking through his mouth. It doesn't have to be factually correct as for what is going to happen tomorrow or in 3 months. But the most important experience of this region, which contains Ukraine, Poland and the Baltic states, and it's important, not all the Eastern Europe, it's just the Russia's direct neighbors. The experience is that there is a long-standing collective habit, which is Russian imperialism. And this Russian imperialism, in a new package of Russian nationalism, has been spreading throughout the past 20 years. So the cases of Chechnya, Georgia and Crimea, of course, are the proofs for such argumentations. It's very important because, of course, you might say, well, this is just fatalism. And this is just thinking that Russians are always like this. They have to behave like this. No, it's not about this. It's about knowing what the historical patterns were, what is probable when the historically grounded Russian imperialism comes back yet again.
Talking about Russian imperialism, and if we're looking at Russia's population right now, is there an appetite for more action, to attack more countries, to bring them back into the fold with the average Russian?
I think the so-called war party of mobilized nationalists who really pursue a very open revanchist agenda is around 10 to 15% of the population. The same size...
That's still a lot.
It's a lot. The same size I would dedicate to calling an anti-war movement, passive or active, because you've seen, for example, in comparison to the last year, you've seen an increase in derailment incidents on Russian railways, which is very similar to what happens in Belarus, up to 50%. There have been more than 20 attacks on military commissariats. So there is some kind of an underground clearly saying this is not a war we want. The problem is the middle, because this means that the absolute majority doesn't care, is apathetic, is fatalistic in a way, which can come from deep Soviet experience of not having a say in country policy making.
And a lot of violence in the past.
A lot of violence in the past.
Done to own society, right?
Indeed, and looking inwards, looking and also facing, to be honest, an unprecedented economic crisis, which has never happened before, with the technological regression, which will bring Russia to, if they succeed in mitigating the risk, to the level of the 90s, if they fail in mitigating the risk, to the level of the 80s. So people, frankly, don't care. And this is a big problem because, of course, this would be the resonating space where some signals could be sent out to stop the aggression.
Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin frames NATO's reaction on the war in Ukraine as an act of aggression. Let's listen in to Vladimir Putin on this very matter.
We have nothing to worry about in terms of membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO. Well, they want it, please. They must understand that there were no threats to them before. Now, if military contingents and infrastructure are deployed there, we will have to mirror this behavior.
We'll have to mirror this behavior. We touched upon this earlier, but can he mirror this kind of troop buildup?
Well, there are long-term trends and plans to strengthen Russia's military posture in the West. If we see how Russia has planned this war and what was the mindset in this war, was that the West is weak, the West is weakening, Europe is decadent, the Americans are pivoting away towards Asia. They don't, as we've seen in Afghanistan, don't have the resources to care for other parts of the world. So there's an opening up for us. We are the great nation, we have the great military. Now we eat Ukraine, and then as a big empire with sort of governing over Ukraine, we will show the rest of these decadent Europeans where the power. Now, of course, it didn't play out that way. But I guess, sort of depending on how this war will be concluded, that he will, the one or the other way, resume to this kind of counter-Western posture, because we have seen an influx. Kaliningrad was militarily reinforced over the years following up to that. The same was for the Arctic Circle, especially the border to Finland. Then after 2020, situation in Belarus, where also we had a lot of influx, not only military, but especially, of course, security presence, FSB assisting the KGB in Belarus itself. So all these are long-standing trends, and of course now Putin has a kind of sticker to apply to them. Yes, it's a reaction to NATO, but one would have conceived that they were planned before. However, of course, the big thing is the war in Ukraine is not going to plan. And whatever the outcome there is the biggest determinant of how many resources, financially, militarily, Russia will have after that to do whatever it intends to do.
One addition, there is
briefly, if you can.
Very briefly. Domestically speaking, the Russian government, the Kremlin, abandons obligations towards its citizens. They go back to an era where we say, well, social security, economic development, that's private. National security is state matter, and this makes it more probable.
But what is important, I believe, is that this escalation of Russia, of Putin's Russia, has a Protean face. It changes the form every time it appears.
I have to go into the last round. This is my last question to all of you, and with a brief statement, please. Are we looking at a new Iron Curtain going down?
Have we not seen it already? I do believe that it already happened, and it happened actually quite some time ago. It was perhaps not very well visible from the Western perspective, but I do believe that the new strategy of NATO shows that there is a certain closeness between the Western perspective and the Eastern perspectives right now.
I think it's a misleading analogy because Russia's economy and society have been so open that it's nearly impossible to close them down in the same fashion it was after the Second World War. So we're going into an unprecedented geopolitical confrontation, and I'm not sure this form of open economy, it's the most globally integrated economy among the BRICS countries. 700,000 Russians have left Russia after the war. This maintains private channels and new ways of influencing what's going on there. I think it's new.
We have a systemic rivalry. It's not the kind of economic different model that Russia proposes as the Soviet Union was, but we have a different model of governance, of policy, of justification, and hence we have this kind of competition. It will be a different Cold War, but it will be a Cold War.
Thank you very much. This was To The Point for this edition. Thank you very much for watching. And if you're watching us on YouTube, do share with us what you think down there in the comments. Thank you very much for watching from me and the team. Bye-bye.